Alright folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and I think it's high time I make a dragon. But not just any dragon, a clickbait a Minecraft dragon. But first, we need materials. Now the plan, in as much as I ever have one, is to put the dragon on top of a rocky outcropping since I want to be able to run wire down through the base and out into a battery pack down near the bottom. I also expect this guy to be pretty heavy, so having a nice heavy base to support the weight is going to play into my favor later. With that in mind, I've chopped up a couple pieces of oak which I'll glue together and then fasten with a few screws. Now I'm kinda winging the dimension of my dragon, but I'm aiming for something that will be roughly 30 centimeters from tip to tail, or for my American viewers, it'll be roughly 30 centimeters worth of inches from tip to tail. Of course, it only ends up being that length because that happens to be the length of the wire I cut, so it's worth taking any measurements with a grain of salt. Ned's eyes will be made out of LEDs, so I'm going to run some heat-resistant silicone wrap up the legs and out the neck so that I can add the eyeballs later. Then I can mark out where his feet will sit on the block and drill some holes to mount him in place. However, before I start adding clay, I want to knock down some of the high spots on the wood, so I'll crack out my chisel and try not to chop a finger off. Then I can mount Ned's skeleton into those pre-drilled holes and run the wiring along the base before coating the entire wooden section in bacon bond so the subsequent clay layer will adhere. Normally I like to use XPS foam for my rocky outcroppings, but Ned's going to be locked in place while I sculpt him, so the whole piece will need to go in the oven. Top tip, don't put XPS foam in the oven if you don't want lung cancer. I don't want lung cancer, so I'm going to make the rocky base out of clay. Basically, I'll just smoosh it on without any concern for uniformity, then I'll poke and prod it with various tools until it's got kind of a rocky, stony looking appearance. And then to add some rocky textures, I'm going to use a rock. I've always found that rocks have a pretty similar texture to rocks, so by pressing them into clay, you can impart that nice, natural, rocky look without too much effort. Now don't worry if your rocks aren't quite as fancy as this rock though, as you can find rocks that cost nothing outside. I decided to pay 10 times that amount and get myself a nice fancy green rock. Otherwise, once the base has been baked and cured, I can add the final sharp rocky edges by cutting and chipping away at the clay. And it's finally time to start making the dragon, so I'll start by bulking out the body with clay until I've got the general proportions that I'm after. I also noticed when I mounted Ned on the base, I realized that his right leg is a bit too long, so to shorten it, I'm going to add a little rocky shelf that he can be standing on. Otherwise, it's back to bulking the body out. Before I make Ned's head, I need to give him some eyeballs, so I'm gonna stick a couple of purple LEDs into my wires, then bend them outwards so that I've got two shiny round eyeballs. Then I'll wrap the base of the LEDs in a little bit of clay to keep them from touching and shorting out, before bulking up the neck and then adding the general shape of the head. Now as far as the body shape is concerned, I'm going for a somewhat iguana-y, long-limbed look, but with a long neck and extra wrinkly skin. To that end, once I've got the body shape looking ship-shape, I'll start to add a whole slew of wrinkly wormy dealies anywhere that his movement would produce wrinkles. I'm not sure what's wrong with me, but I think lizard wrinkles are hella cute, so Ned's getting a whole bunch of them. Of course, you can't forget his hands, which start as a little ball that gets chopped in half, flattened out, then 3 little fingies get cut into it, and with a little pinching, rolling, and pulling, you'll end up with some pretty excellent little dragon feet. Then I can add some little dragon nails before sticking them in place, blending them into the leg, and adding a little bit of texture. Then it's just a case of repeating the process 3 more times until Ned's got a full set of dragon feet. Finally, with all the pieces in place, I'll brush the entire body with some isopropyl alcohol, which will help remove fingerprints, blend in sharp edges, and smooth away some of the blending marks. Then it's time to add the little details, starting with his horns. I rolled a little ball of clay into a long cone shape, which I'll then bend into a slightly more interesting than straight, wavy horn before baking it so that I can come back with my knife, a little chisel, and some sandpaper to add a little bit of texture. Then I can stick it in place along with its matching partner before getting started making the dorsal spikes. I'll start by marking out where each of the spikes will go along the spine. Then I'll add some blobs of clay into each of the divots before removing them all again so that I can add the skin texture. To make the aforementioned skin texture, I'm gonna make a texture roller using a little blob of clay and some ball styluses of varying sizes. And then once that's baked, I'm left with a funny looking pink potato. However, when you roll this little potato on Ned, it leaves behind a pretty terrific scaly texture that I think is pretty neato. I'll also gently cut into the surface with my sharp-ish silicone shaper to add a bit of that weathered dinosaur-looking skin before brushing over everything once more with a coat of alcohol. Finally, with the texture done, I can put the spikes back in place. Then I can blend them into the body, give them a bit more of an interesting shape, add a little bit of texture, and then finally add the cuticle of the spike? Whatever the skin that surrounds a spike is called. Add that. Oh yeah, I also decided I didn't like how Ned's head was looking, so I remade it. This time it's a bit shorter and it doesn't look quite as inebriated. Otherwise, the only thing left to do is add some teeny tiny teeth. And to make said teeth, I'm going to take a teeny tiny ball of clay, roll it out so that it's nice and pointy, and then I'll add it to all the other teeny tiny teethsies. Once these have been baked, I'll carefully press them into place, making sure to hide the entire process behind my big ugly hand. Otherwise, I'll add a little bit more texture to the head, and it's time to make some wings. Make sure that both my wings are identical in shape and size. I've made a template that I can use to bend my wire into the correct length and shape. I'm also using steel wire here since I want to make sure it's as rigid as possible without having to use the thick gauge wire. Then I'll mark out where they'll attach the body, drill some holes, and reposition the armature until I've got a good looking pose. However, there's no way that I can fit this entire model in my oven, so I'll have to sculpt the wings individually and attach them later. Otherwise, the wings are pretty straightforward at this point. I'll start by covering the entirety of the wire in a very thin layer of clay, making sure to cover the shape of the wire underneath. Then I'll give the entire thing a quick once-over with my texture roller before getting started on the webbing. In the past, I've used mesh wire to secure the clay in place when I've made wings, but today I'm just going to use some super thin sheets of cause clay. This stuff is basically a rubberized polymer clay, but when you bake it, it is super flexible, and the thinner the sheet of the clay, the more flexible it seems to be. After rolling it as thin as my pasta machine goes, I'll stretch it over the wing fingers, press it into place, and then cut off any of the excess. Then I'll blend it into the wingers to keep it in place, and then repeat the same process until the wing is covered. Finally, I'll give it a quick alcohol painting and a bit of texturing before cutting little rips and tears into the wings. Of course, things have been going a bit too well at this point, so I feel like now would be a great time to do a goof. Basically, I flew a little too close to the sun and melted my wings. Or, more accurately, I rebaked the wings after twisting and bending, and while cause clay is super flexible when it's baked in room temperature, if you put it back into the oven again, you end up with copious cracks and fractures. Not a big deal though, since it really just means that Ned's wings will be a little more tattered and worn. Otherwise, the wings are done and I can reattach them to the body. Now, because I can't leave well enough alone, there's a few little gaps between the wings and the body, but they're easily filled with a bit more clay and cured with a heat gun. Finally, before getting on to the painting, I'll take a minute to attach the wires to the battery pack and make sure that my eyeballs light up. To house the battery pack, I've made a tiny riser out of foam that I can fit the battery in, then glue the base onto. I'll paint this black and hopefully it will be mostly invisible. Then it's on to the painting, starting with a white primer over the entire model. Now I'm gonna be sticking with the black dragon theme here, and while I know the Ender Dragon perches on an obsidian pillar, I feel like that's just a bit too much black and it would all mash together. So to help Ned stand out a bit, I'm gonna be painting his perch with lighter gray washes. I'll start with a light gray over the entire base, letting it run and seep into all the cracks and cuts before applying a heavy coat of almost black. I'll make sure to wick that away from the flat surfaces, but I'll allow it to really get into the cracks. Then to give it a little bit of color variation, I'll add a tiny bit of green and brown, then leave it to dry before coming back with a light gray dry brush, followed by a lighter gray dry brush, followed by a final feathering of just white on the tips. To keep my freshly painted base looking pristine, I'll wrap it in cling film before getting started on Ned. Now my plan with Ned was to give him the same treatment of washes and dry brushing to really highlight the scales and the surface detail. But then I quickly realized that instead of him being a black dragon on a black rock, he was just a gray dragon on a gray rock. So instead I went all in on the black and just gave him a much more opaque coat. In the end, I was still able to capture a lot of surface detail with the dry brushing, and I was able to give him a pretty nice purpley appearance by dry brushing his scales with the same color as his belly. I also decided his wings were a bit dull, so I cracked out the old airbrush and added a white gradient from the tips to the center before deciding that they looked better in purple. Then I painted his spikes, horns, and teeth with a bone white base coat, then hit them with an umber wash to highlight the grooves and cracks, followed by a dry brushing of that original bone white to catch the edges. Finally, I painted the base black, and we're on to the glamour shots. As always, this channel continues to exist thanks to the support of the beautiful people over on Patreon. Without them, these weekly tiny nerdy things simply wouldn't be possible. So a big shout out to my newest patrons, Aubrey Knoller, Travis Caterer, 8 Pump Chai, Kier, Matt Sellenberg, Jeffrey Jetton, Jackie, Royal Leffelman, Inanimate Cosplay, Greg Allers, Wendy Austin Rawlings, Spherical Horse, Julia Meyer, Zara Garza, and Desaf Svag. You are the ripped, torn, and tattered wings that keep this wrinkly lizard of a channel in the air. If you'd like to help out, as well as see how the sausage is made and get some high-quality glamour shot photos, then head on over to Patreon and have a wee gander. If you're new here, feel free to tickle that little subscription button. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.